Jamie Rothwell's name once echoed through the back streets of Salford, whispered in fear, spoken in respect, and written in the encrypted messages that would one day destroy him. What began as one man's rise from small-time dealer to the mastermind of a 26 million pound drug empire ended in a downfall no one saw coming. When investigators cracked the supposedly unbreakable EncroChat network, Jamie's secret world of coded deals, hidden cash, and ruthless control was exposed line by line. His empire wasn't taken down by rivals or raids. It was undone by his own words, typed into a phone he believed would keep him safe forever. Jamie Rothwell grew up in the shadow of Salford's grey tower blocks, where the streets were both a playground and a battlefield. From an early age, he understood that power came not from strength alone, but from knowing when to strike and when to stay quiet. He wasn't the loudest, the toughest, or the flashiest, but he had a sharp mind and an instinct for opportunity. While others wasted their energy chasing fights or quick cash, Jamie studied the way money moved through the estate, who controlled it, who supplied it, and who ended up in debt. At first his role was simple. He ran errands for older dealers, delivering packages and collecting payments. He learned how to spot undercover cars, how to handle street lookouts, and how to make people trust him just enough to keep talking. Every small job was a lesson in control. When one of the older men was arrested, Jamie quietly stepped in to take over his corner. He kept prices steady, paid people on time, and treated the business like a trade rather than a gamble. His calmness set him apart, and soon he had a small team working for him. Money started coming faster than he expected. He bought better clothes, rented flashier cars, and started to enjoy the kind of attention he once envied. But Jamie wasn't content with street-level profits. He wanted scale. He wanted structure. He began making connections beyond Salford. Dealers from Liverpool, couriers from Birmingham, and suppliers linked to Europe. His contacts grew, and so did his reputation. By his mid-20s, he was no longer just another dealer. He was managing one of the most reliable supply lines in the region. To the outside world, Jamie blended in. He still visited his old haunts, bought drinks for locals, and kept his circle small. But behind closed doors he ran a growing criminal enterprise that stretched across the northwest. He had stash houses in quiet suburbs, couriers who could move drugs undetected, and accountants who cleaned his money through shell companies. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. Every step was calculated to reduce risk. Jamie believed he had mastered the art of invisibility, staying rich without attracting too much attention. Police knew his name, of course, they always did. But without direct evidence, he was untouchable. He rarely carried drugs himself, never left messages on unsecured phones, and used trusted middlemen for every major deal. Surveillance turned up nothing concrete. Every time detectives thought they were close, Jamie vanished into the background. To his rivals he was both feared and respected, the man who could make problems disappear and profits multiply. His success came with paranoia. He checked his car for trackers, moved homes every few months, and avoided photos or social media. Trust was rare, loyalty was temporary, and money was the only thing that stayed constant. He surrounded himself with people who owed him, but never with people he couldn't replace. By the time most realized how powerful he had become, Jamie Rothwell had already built an empire. It was worth millions, controlled dozens of people, and operated with military precision. He felt untouchable, a ghost in plain sight. But what Jamie didn't know was that the same ambition that had built his fortune would soon expose him to a new kind of enemy, one that didn't chase him through the streets, but watched him through the screen. By the time Jamie Rothwell's operation was running smoothly, he began to see communication as his biggest risk. The more successful he became, the harder it was to keep control. Phones could be tapped, messages intercepted, and meetings watched. He needed a system that allowed him to speak freely without fear of exposure. That's when he discovered EncroChat. It was marketed quietly, almost mythically, among criminal circles, a network built for the cautious and the clever. Its users were told it was untraceable, using encrypted devices that could self-destruct at the push of a button. For Jamie, it felt like the perfect answer. The first time he held an EncroPhone, he treated it with near reverence. It was sleek, simple, and carried a sense of power. The promise was total secrecy. Every message was scrambled by layers of encryption, routed through foreign servers, and hidden from the reach of police surveillance. Using his new handle, Nasty Piranha, Jamie set up his digital empire. He created group chats for his lieutenants, arranged deliveries, negotiated prices, and coordinated payments, all through short, coded messages. To him it was a digital fortress, an invisible wall separating his world from law enforcement. EncroChat changed everything. What once took risky face-to-face meetings could now be handled in seconds. He could plan shipments from Spain to Manchester without leaving his living room. He used nicknames for associates, coded terms for drugs, and random numbers for cash values. Each week his business grew more efficient. His runners received instructions instantly, payments were confirmed in real time, and no one ever had to speak a word over a normal phone again. Jamie started to believe he had mastered the future of organized crime. The sense of safety made him bolder. He began discussing larger shipments and riskier ventures, confident that no known could ever trace the messages back to him. Photos of high-value packages were sent, images of money piles shared, and coded instructions flowed like routine office emails. He no longer relied on small-time couriers. He now dealt with international suppliers who trusted the same encrypted system. The profit margins skyrocketed, and the operation became more sophisticated than ever. Jamie expanded his money laundering network using cryptocurrency transfers and offshore accounts. Every move was logged and discussed through the device he believed was untouchable. But behind that illusion of control, cracks were forming in the shadows. Unknown to Jamie, the same network that gave him confidence was already under quiet investigation. European cybercrime units had taken an interest in EncroChat, suspecting it was being used to coordinate large-scale criminal activity across the continent. Teams of specialists were working day and night to find a way in, a digital key to unlock the underworld's most secret conversations. Jamie noticed none of it. He was too deep in the comfort of his encrypted empire, certain that technology had made him invincible. For him, EncroChat wasn't just a tool, it was a lifeline. He believed it separated him from the chaos that took down other criminals. What he couldn't see was that the system he trusted most would soon become the very thing that exposed him. In chasing absolute security, Jamie Rothwell had unknowingly built his empire on borrowed time. In early 2020, a secret operation began deep within the walls of European cybercrime units. For months, investigators had watched EncroChat from afar, tracing whispers of its use in everything from drug smuggling to contract killings. They knew the network was vast, its users disciplined, and its encryption near impossible to break. But what seemed uncrackable soon became their greatest challenge. Teams of forensic experts, digital engineers, and intelligence officers from multiple countries combined their efforts to find a weakness. Somewhere inside the system, there had to be a single door left unlocked. The breakthrough came quietly. A piece of malware was developed, stealthy, undetectable, and designed to infiltrate EncroChat's core servers. It didn't just copy messages, it lived inside the phones themselves, recording everything users sent and received before encryption could protect it. Once deployed, the hack spread silently across thousands of devices. Overnight, messages that were meant to be private started appearing on police servers. It was one of the most significant breaches in law enforcement history, and not a single user suspected it had happened. Among the ocean of intercepted messages, one alias stood out to analysts in the UK. Nasty Piranha. The messages under that name spoke with confidence and precision. There were references to kilos of drugs, coded bank movements, and vehicles used for transportation. The tone was calm, commanding, and unmistakably that of someone in control. Investigators began piecing together patterns, frequent contact with other handles like Swift Eagle and Red Duke, discussions of stash houses and updates on shipments arriving through Liverpool docks. Every message added another thread to the web. At first, the detectives couldn't believe how open the messages were. Users described exact weights, prices, and delivery times. They sent photos of cash, street locations, and handwritten notes. They even boasted about profits and dodging surveillance. It was like reading the diary of an underground empire, written in real time. The only challenge was decoding the language. Phrases like half a bird and 5 tins were cross-referenced with known slang until investigators built a complete dictionary of Jamie Rothwell's world. Once they matched the activity to physical events, everything clicked. Police surveillance reports confirmed cars and properties mentioned in the chats. CCTV footage linked certain vehicles to known associates of Rothwell. Bank records mirrored payment schedules discussed in the messages. Slowly, Nasty Piranha was no longer just a username, it was a person, and that person was Jamie Rothwell. The net was forming invisibly around him. By the time Jamie realized something was wrong within his network, it was already too late. Law enforcement was months ahead, watching every move, recording every digital whisper. To them, the EncroChat hack was gold. It provided insight not only into his operation but into hundreds of others across the UK. They saw alliances, rivalries, debts, and betrayals, all in the space of a few text messages. The once hidden world of organized crime was suddenly laid bare. The most chilling part was that Jamie never noticed. He still used his phone daily, still planned shipments and discussed money laundering. He was unknowingly providing investigators with a step-by-step record of his downfall. Every message, every photo, every instruction became evidence. The hack had turned his trusted tool of secrecy into a weapon aimed squarely at him. While he slept soundly believing he was untouchable, police across Europe were reading his messages in real time, patiently preparing the strike that would end his empire forever. The first signs of trouble arrived quietly, almost unnoticeably, like cracks forming beneath the surface of solid ground. Jamie Rothwell's operation had been running smoothly for years, but in the spring of 2020 things began to feel off. A delivery from Spain that was supposed to arrive on schedule vanished without explanation. A trusted courier suddenly stopped answering his phone. Weeks later, one of his stash houses in Salford was raided in what the police described as a routine operation. They seized nothing major, but the precision of the raid unsettled Jamie. The police seemed to know exactly where to look. He began to wonder if someone inside his circle had turned. At first, he handled it calmly. He shifted storage locations, replaced a few contacts, and ordered everyone to keep communication to EncroChat only. But the tension in his network was growing. People were nervous. Too many arrests were happening in too short a time. Word spread of major players across the country being taken down. All of them users of the same encrypted phones. Jamie refused to believe the technology could be compromised. He convinced himself that the raids were coincidence or the result of loose talk. Still, unease gnawed at him. He could feel the invisible weight of something closing in. Each day brought new problems. Cash collections went missing, phone lines went dead, and previously reliable connections started avoiding contact. Jamie's empire, once organized and efficient, began to unravel piece by piece. He ordered more caution, but fear had already infected the ranks. Couriers stopped showing up. One of his lieutenants disappeared entirely, and rumors spread that he'd been arrested. The flow of drugs slowed, and profits began to drop. For a man who had always controlled everything, the uncertainty was unbearable. In desperation, Jamie tightened his inner circle. He shut down several distribution points and stored all remaining stock in a single location he believed was safe. He moved between safe houses nightly, never sleeping in the same bed twice. He paid for burner cars and demanded updates every hour from his remaining men. Yet no matter what he did, the sense of being watched wouldn't fade. He noticed unmarked vans near his routes, unfamiliar cars parked too long on quiet roads. His paranoia grew into obsession. He began deleting messages, resetting his phones and burning handwritten notes, but the messages he feared were already out there, copied and catalogued by investigators months before. The EncroChat breach had already mapped every link in his operation. Police didn't need to chase him blindly by Mori. They were dismantling his network from the edges inward, one arrest at a time. Jamie could feel it happening but couldn't see how. His world was shrinking. The men who once obeyed him now avoided him. The streets that once brought him power now echoed with whispers of betrayal and collapse. Still, he refused to believe it was over. He told himself that he had rebuilt before and could do it again. He began preparing to leave the country, planning to start fresh abroad with the money he had hidden. But behind every plan there was doubt. He didn't know that his every move was being watched, his conversations already recorded, his fate already sealed. The empire he had built through control and caution was collapsing silently, undone not by rivals or police raids in the streets, but by invisible messages he had sent himself. The morning of the raid began like any other. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the rustle of trees outside the farmhouse. Jamie Rothwell had chosen as his final hideout. He believed he was safe there, far from Salford, hidden behind long country roads and empty fields. Inside, boxes of cash and documents lined the floor, a final attempt to move what was left of his empire. He had planned to leave the country within days, possibly heading to Spain, where old contacts still owed him favors. But while Jamie packed his last bag, a dozen unmarked police vehicles were already creeping toward the property in complete silence. The raid had been planned for weeks, based on a trail of digital evidence collected from his EncroChat messages. Investigators had tracked every move since the first breach, using GPS data, intercepted conversations, and financial links to pinpoint his location. They knew when he would be there, what vehicles were parked outside, and even which exit he might use if he tried to escape. Just before sunrise, armed officers surrounded the farmhouse, blocking every possible route. The operation was swift, rehearsed, and mercilessly efficient. Inside, Jamie noticed the sudden flash of movement outside the window, a flicker of headlights in the distance. Before he could react, the door exploded inward with a thunderous crack. Shouts filled the air as officers stormed in, their movements synchronized and precise. Jamie froze. For a man who had spent years controlling chaos, he was now standing helpless in the middle of it. He didn't reach for a weapon or try to run. He simply raised his hands as the reality of his situation sank in. The myth of invincibility he had built around himself shattered in seconds. Within minutes, the entire property was under police control. Officers moved methodically, collecting evidence and photographing every detail. They found 3 EncroChat devices hidden in a drawer, each one loaded with messages that tied him directly to the nasty Piranha account. Bags of cash were seized, totaling hundreds of thousands of pounds. There were ledgers filled with coded figures, encrypted USB drives, and a notebook listing transactions and contact numbers. Every item matched information already extracted from the EncroChat data. To the investigators, it was confirmation of everything they'd built their case around. Outside, as Jamie sat handcuffed in the back of a police van, he stared out at the fields. For the first time in years, the world around him felt still. No phones, no orders, no decisions to make. Just silence. He knew the evidence was overwhelming. The look on the officers' faces told him they weren't guessing anymore. They knew. The life he had built through precision and secrecy had been undone by invisible technology, and now the walls were closing in for good. News of his arrest spread quickly through Salford. Associates vanished, some arrested within hours, others fleeing before dawn. Raids swept across Manchester and Liverpool, striking at the remnants of his once sprawling network. What had taken Jamie years to build collapsed in a single morning. Every warehouse, every stash house, every contact had been mapped and neutralized. The empire that once operated in shadows was now exposed under bright floodlights and police cameras. As Jamie was driven away, he didn't speak. He didn't resist or argue. There was nothing left to say. The last image he saw of his empire was a line of officers carrying boxes of evidence out of the farmhouse, each one filled with the remains of his criminal legacy. He had once believed he was too smart to ever be caught, too disciplined to make mistakes. But as the van doors slammed shut, one truth became impossible to ignore. His downfall hadn't come from betrayal, greed, or violence. It had come from the messages he'd sent with his own hands, believing no one would ever read them. Jamie Rothwell's arrest sent ripples across the entire Northwest underworld. For years his name had carried quiet authority, a mixture of fear and respect. Now, that name was being spoken in police stations, courtrooms, and newspapers. While Jamie sat in a holding cell, investigators worked relentlessly to piece together the full scale of his operation. They didn't need his cooperation. The evidence they already had was vast. Thousands of EncroChat messages decoded and catalogued, mapped out every corner of his empire in staggering detail. His rise, his profits, his alliances, and even his private frustrations were written in his own words. Detectives began sorting through his messages, linking them to real-world events. Every delivery mentioned in the chats had a corresponding record: car sightings, intercepted packages, or recovered cash. The coded nicknames that once shielded his contacts were unraveled one by one, each linked to a real person through forensic work and surveillance. Before long, the full structure of Jamie's network was visible: a web of suppliers, couriers, money launderers, and enforcers, stretching across multiple cities. What had once been invisible now existed in black and white, supported by timestamps and coordinates. The EncroChat data became the backbone of one of the largest organized crime cases the region had ever seen. Detectives didn't need to rely on informants or wiretaps anymore. The transcripts were as clear as confessions. Some messages even contained photographs of cash, drugs, and weapons, sent casually by men who believed the system was unbreakable. Investigators matched these photos with seized evidence, confirming everything from product packaging to serial numbers on banknotes. It was meticulous work, and it left no room for doubt. Jamie's closest associates began to fall quickly. One by one, they were identified and arrested. Some tried to deny involvement, claiming mistaken identity, but the messages betrayed them. Their slang, their routines, even their typing styles, became tools of identification. Faced with overwhelming evidence, several of Jamie's trusted men turned informants. They traded details of storage units, smuggling routes, and money laundering fronts in exchange for reduced sentences. Each confession pulled another thread from what was left of his operation. Meanwhile, Jamie maintained his silence. During questioning, he sat motionless, refusing to speak. He believed that without a confession, he could still find a way to fight the case. But the investigators didn't need him to talk. The EncroChat transcripts told his story better than he ever could. They painted a picture of a man who commanded millions, orchestrated violence from afar, and operated with complete confidence in his anonymity. The messages were so detailed that they even recorded disputes over payments and plans for new shipments. As prosecutors built their case, Jamie began to understand the scale of what he was facing. Every encrypted conversation, every photo, every transaction had been stored and analyzed. The system he had trusted to protect him had instead created a permanent record of his crimes. There was no hiding from it. Even his attempts to clean money through property deals and cryptocurrency transfers were tracked and exposed. Outside, the world that had once bowed to him was dissolving. His businesses were frozen, his cars impounded, and his assets seized under proceeds of crime laws. Friends stopped visiting. Associates distanced themselves. The few who had once praised him now whispered that he'd grown careless. For the first time, Jamie faced the one thing he'd always managed to avoid: complete powerlessness. His empire, once built on control and precision, had turned into evidence against him. The same digital network that had made him rich had become the foundation of his downfall. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the front rows. sketch artists captured every expression, and detectives who had spent years building the case watched silently from the gallery. Jamie Rothwell entered wearing a plain suit, his expression unreadable. He looked smaller than the man whose name had dominated headlines, calm, almost detached, as if watching someone else's story unfold. But the evidence against him was impossible to ignore. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of digital forensics, built almost entirely on the words Jamie had once believed would disappear forever. The opening statements painted him not as a street criminal, but as the calculating architect of a 26 million town drug empire. The prosecutor spoke with quiet confidence, describing how every encrypted message sent through the Nasty Piranha account had been traced, verified, and matched to real-world activity. As the evidence was displayed on large screens, the courtroom saw fragments of Jamie's world-coded messages discussing half-birds, boxes, and tickets, all decoded into precise amounts of cocaine, heroin, and cash. The tone of the messages was cold and businesslike, as if discussing shipments of furniture rather than drugs. Investigators presented photographs, extracted from his devices, stacks of money, drugs, packaged in vacuum-sealed bricks, luxury watches, and cars. Each image came with a corresponding message confirming its context. The prosecution detailed how the EncroChat data had exposed not just transactions, but the hierarchy of his organization. It showed how orders came from Jamie, filtered down through lieutenants, and reached street dealers across Manchester and Liverpool. Every step of the operation was documented through his own instruction. The defense tried to argue that the EncroChat data was unreliable, that it might have been tampered with or misinterpreted. But the prosecution dismantled that claim with precision. Experts testified about the integrity of the data and the global investigation that uncovered it. They explained how the messages were captured before encryption, making them exact digital copies of what users had written. Then came the testimonies from former associates, men who had once carried out Jamie's orders. Some spoke reluctantly, others with bitterness, but their words aligned perfectly with the digital evidence. Each statement tightened the noose. Throughout it all, Jamie remained silent. He sat with his hands clasped, staring straight ahead, never reacting to the damning details read aloud. When his finances were examined, the extent of his empire became clear. Offshore accounts, luxury properties bought through shell companies, and laundered cash hidden in legitimate businesses. It was a sophisticated network that had thrived on secrecy, yet it had all been undone by invisible data flowing through intercepted servers. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. It didn't take long. They returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all major counts, including conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and money laundering. Jamie listened to the verdict without emotion. When the judge delivered the sentence, describing him as a man who had built an empire on greed and control, Jamie simply nodded once. Years of power, wealth, and fear collapsed into silence. As he was led away, flashes from cameras filled the hallway outside the courtroom. The empire that had once seemed untouchable was gone, reduced to evidence files and digital transcript. The legend of Jamie Rothwell, the ghost of Salford, ended not with gunfire or betrayal but with the quiet click of a keyboard somewhere in Europe. His downfall was not dramatic but absolute. For all his intelligence and caution, the one thing he trusted most, the promise of secrecy, had become the weapon that destroyed him. In the aftermath of Jamie Rothwell's conviction, a new reality settled over the criminal underworld of Salford and beyond. The name that once commanded silence and respect was now spoken in disbelief. To many, his fall marked the end of an era. Proof that even the most sophisticated operations could be dismantled by unseen forces. In the months following his sentencing, police across the UK continued to make arrests based on the EncroChat data. The fallout was massive. Hundreds of encrypted users were identified, entire supply chains exposed, and long-hidden connections between gangs uncovered. Jamie's case had opened the floodgates, and the underworld was suddenly drenched in fear. From his prison cell, Jamie spent his days replaying every decision that had led him there. The walls around him felt colder than he imagined. the silence heavier. For years he had believed he was smarter than the system, that he could outthink anyone chasing him. But now, as he stared at the blank ceiling, he saw the arrogance in that belief. The empire he had built on discipline and paranoia had collapsed not through betrayal or violence, but through his blind trust in technology. Every encrypted word, every coded deal, had been a brick in the structure of his own destruction. Outside, the police hailed the EncroChat breach as a breakthrough in modern policing. It had given investigators something they'd never had before: direct, undeniable access to the private world of organized crime. Messages that once existed only in the shadows were now presented in courtrooms as irrefutable evidence. The operation was described as the digital equivalent of lifting the lid on a secret society. Jamie Rothwell's case became a landmark example, studied by law enforcement agencies across Europe. It proved that even the cleverest systems could be cracked, that there was no such thing as total privacy when crime was involved. In Salford, the spaces Jamie once ruled changed quickly. His old haunts were quiet now, his lieutenants either imprisoned or vanished. Young dealers who once idolized him whispered his name as a warning rather than a legend. The empire that had seemed so vast and permanent was gone, its money confiscated, its leaders scattered. His properties were sold off, his cars auctioned, and his hidden accounts traced and frozen. Even the few who still respected him did so from a distance, afraid to be associated with the ghosts of his network. Yet despite his downfall, a certain fascination lingered. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and online forums dissected his story, portraying him as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of how technology had reshaped crime. To the public, he was a name attached to headlines. To those who had known him, he was a reminder of how power can vanish overnight. Jamie rarely spoke during his sentence, but he understood one thing clearly: the world had changed. The age of hidden empires built on encrypted systems was over. Every message left a footprint, every digital shadow could be followed. His story became a lesson, not just for criminals, but for everyone who believed that secrecy was permanent in the digital age. The empire of 26 millions was gone, erased by invisible code. In the end, the same network that once made him powerful proved that no empire, no matter how carefully hidden, can survive when the walls of privacy finally fall.